one of my mentors and people who I've really looked up to as I have grown up in the Presbyterian Church and found my way into mission and ministry. And so I brought his book with me tonight in the hopes that he might sign it. But if you haven't picked up this book, Faithful Resistance, it's wonderful and filled with lots of stories and practical applications of how we as Presbyterians can engage in this very meaningful work for social justice and peace building. And without further ado, I would like to invite Rick Ufford-Chase.
Christy, can you tell us who you are?
Oh.
Can you tell us who you are?
That's a good idea.
I completely forgot to tell you who I am. My name is Christy Van Nostren. I serve as immigrant accompaniment organizer with Pacific and San Gabriel Presbyteries. Yay! And I've gotten to work closely with Merilie during visits to the Adelanto Detention Center. And I did not bring business cards or flyers or any information about our SoCal Presbyterian Immigrant Accompaniment Ministry. But if that's something you might be interested in learning more about, please come find me and we can connect. Thanks.
Good evening. It is such an incredible pleasure to be with all of you, and I'm so grateful to all of you, particularly those folks on the planning committee who pulled together this event this evening. And I just want to go out of my way to pause for a moment and say thank you for this remarkable celebration and for allowing me to be a part of it. When I stepped back from the position of director of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, I did so on the condition that Emily Brewer would be hired full-time to replace me. And I told Emily, yeah, that was a good move, wasn't it? I told Emily that I would do anything I was asked to do and nothing that I wasn't asked to do for the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. And every once in a while, folks surprise me and ask me to show up in places that I'm really thrilled to be. Anytime I get asked to spend an evening in the vicinity of the Zender brothers, it's a total thrill. And Merilie, I don't know that you know this, but the Barstow Driver Award was an idea that I had in the middle of the night. The last year before, I think it was the last year or two before I stepped back from the position of director of the Peace Fellowship. And I woke up the next morning and said, we need an award for people who are performing nonviolent direct action in excellent ways in retirement in particular. And I think, are you the sixth recipient of this award, Merilie? And every one of these opportunities to lift up the folks who are really doing the work every day has been just a huge honor for me personally. I think I've only missed one of the awards dinners, actually, though I haven't spoken at each one. And so, Merilie, before I begin tonight, many other people will tell you this tonight, but you have shaped my life as you have shaped so many other lives over the last 20 years, and I am so grateful for your continued work, and I want to be you when I grow up. So, I'm going to read a scripture to ground our conversation tonight, but before I do, I want to offer a disclaimer. And I say it both a little bit in jest and a little bit in seriousness. You all have caught me in the midst of something of a prolonged crisis of faith. And I'm trying to figure out what to do with that crisis of faith, and I'm trying to figure out ways to talk about it in front of other people and with other people, because I'm betting I'm not the only one. And so tonight, I'm going to try out some of my angst-ridden reflection about that crisis of faith with all of you, and invite you to be a part of it with me, and that we might strengthen one another during what I think are very challenging times. So with that disclaimer, I'd like to begin with a brief story from the book of Matthew that will be familiar to all of you, from the 25th chapter of the book of Matthew, not the one that we usually focus on, but rather the first pericope that goes from verses 1 to 13. Listen now to the word of God. Well, then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, "Look, here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps, and the foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." The wise replied, "No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves." And while they went to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the other bridesmaids came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." This is the somewhat troubling word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, 11 years ago, my wife Kitty and I made a pretty dramatic decision in our lives to leave the border after 20 years working there together, primarily on immigration issues, and to change gears, and we moved to Stony Point Center with a clear commitment to found a multi-faith community at Stony Point Center of Christians and Jews and Muslims who would come together because of a shared commitment to justice and peace and earth care work in the world, and because of a shared commitment to radical hospitality and to inviting others into the space at Stony Point Center. It's been a very difficult journey. There's nothing easy about the formation of this community. It is by far and away the hardest work I have ever done in my life. And I continue to believe remarkably important work and worthwhile work at the same time. I didn't know much when I started in this community. I was remarkably ignorant about the ways in which Christians have impacted the lives of Muslims and Jews and so many others as well in the world. And as we began, Mark Johnson, who's in the room tonight, and several others, Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb, whom some of you in the room know, and Rabia Terry Harris, and my wife Kitty and I, the 5 of us, were the founders of this multi-faith community. And Rabbi Lynn kept talking about that period of time in Spain known as the Convivencia, the time from roughly 750 to roughly the last vestiges of this time ended somewhere in the late 1400s. The shining moment of Christian, Muslim, Jewish relationships was really from about 800 to about 1100 CE. I'm not an historian, so if you know better than I do, you can educate me later. And so I began learning more and more about that as we began to carry out our life together at Stony Point Center. And Kitty and I have dreamed for years of trying to go to this region in southern Spain called the Andalusia, the region of southern Spain where this experiment was taking place. This is a time when the Muslims were largely in control, but brought a great deal of openness to Jewish and Christian folks, and there was a time of great convivencia, an ability to live well together is really what that word means. And so we went last month, Kitty and I, with her 83-year-old mother, to travel together for 10 days in this region, and we began our journey in Granada and visiting the Alhambra, which was a remarkable experience that I really had no idea. I had no idea going in exactly what that would mean to me. We went from Granada then to Cordoba, where we spent time visiting the Mezquita, this huge mosque, bigger than the physical Vatican itself, built, when was it, CE? And then later the Christians came and literally built a huge cathedral in the center of the mosque, and you can still see both of those things interacting with one another. And we finished our trip in Sevilla and visiting the Alcázar, the monarchical palace in Sevilla, Spain. And I had been growing, I confess to you, increasingly anxious throughout our trip, because everywhere I went, I could no longer escape the reality that the Christian conquest of that region had really destroyed this, not just this marvelous experiment, but also all of what went with it in terms of the cultural icons, and you could just see what had taken place as we traveled from place to place. I asked everyone I could meet as we traveled to Cordoba, is there any attempt being made now in the year 2019 to have Christians share control of this huge mosque with the cathedral built in the center of it with Muslims who might pray there still today on a regular basis? And the answer was kind of a quizzical look and a wonder why I would even raise the question. It doesn't mean that nothing's going on, but I could find no sign of it in my 4 days in Cordoba. And then this is all by way of setup for my last visit in Sevilla, when we went to the Alcázar. And I'm not much for castles, and we saw a lot of them on this trip. And we went into this huge castle that is still an active castle today. The royal family of Spain still regularly visits this location. And we walked in, there are tours going on, and we had a private tour guide to help my mother-in-law. And she took us first into this room, probably just slightly smaller than this room, with a tall ceiling. And she said to us, this is the room where Christopher Columbus negotiated in 1516 with the King of Spain to fund his second set of excursions to the New World. And I had learned in the previous parts of my trip, particularly in Cordoba, that much of that activity of Columbus and other explorers was actually funded by money that was stolen from Jews who were forced out by the Christians. They were told they had to leave the country in the late 1400s, and then their property was confiscated and used to fund the misadventures that would take place in the name of Christianity as Columbus came across the ocean. And on the wall, in this room where this had been negotiated, was a large painting. And I actually have a picture of it on my phone that I've reviewed this afternoon to kind of remind myself. But it has a towering painting of the mother of Jesus, Mary, the mother of Jesus. And then in much smaller relief at the bottom are Christopher Columbus and all of the King of Spain and all of the various conquistadors kind of gathered at her feet. And then off to one side in the lower left of this painting, it's actually a triptych with 3 panels. On the lower left is a picture of a conquistador on horseback, and at his feet are the heads of Moors that he has just cut off, rolling at his feet. And in one other piece, so that you don't miss the point, in the upper right triptych, there is a picture of some church figure, a male, wearing all the vestments of the office, with a halo around his head and holding in his hand a boat that looks suspiciously like the one that Christopher Columbus sailed across the ocean in. For several years, I have increasingly gone to bed at night, and I mean this. I lie in bed at night, some nights, thinking to myself, is it even possible for us as Christians to do anything that could make up for the unbelievable harm that we have caused in the name of Christianity? And I was shocked because I went to Spain expecting to see, to lift up that history, those moments in which Christians and Muslims and Jews had kind of the best of their relationship together. And instead I came home deeply concerned for the ways in which Christianity, an admittedly bastardized version of Christianity, has been used to disrupt and commit genocide and steal land all over this hemisphere. There you go. I'm full of cheer tonight, aren't I?
Yeah.
So I'm going to set that story aside for just a moment and tell you a couple of other brief stories. In August, a good friend of mine named Charo Reina, who is the founder of a little organization led by immigrants in Rockland County, the smallest county in New York, just north of New York City where I live, smallest county in the state of New York. Charo, shortly after the inauguration of President Trump, called me and said, Ricardo, and anytime a Latin American woman leads with Ricardo and a roll of the eyes, I know I'm in trouble. Charo called me up and she said, everyone I know is scared to death what are we going to do? And so together, with some support, we created this little organization that she named Proyecto Faro, the Lighthouse Project, to try and be an immigrant-led support system for immigrants in our county who were feeling at risk, regardless of their status. It really didn't matter what status they had. In August, Charo called me up one morning and she said, Rick, I just got a phone call from a woman in Spring Valley. This is a small town, the poorest town in our county. And she told the story of a raid, an immigration raid that took place where some 9 or 10 ICE officials, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents, showed up in unmarked cars and wearing no uniforms and with no ID to announce themselves, and surrounded the front of their home and then knocked on the front door. And a woman went to the front, the woman of the home went to the front door, and she's Guatemalan, and she answered the door. She just yelled through the door, "What do you want?" And they said, "We want to talk with your husband." And she went and woke him up. He had worked most of the night. He got up kind of groggy and went to the door also. And he opened the door and stepped out the door onto the porch to talk with them. And they immediately arrested him, put him in handcuffs, and did not announce to him until he was out on the porch who they were or what they were doing. And then took him away and left this woman and their 4 children, a 2-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 19-year-old, with no support system. He's now been detained since then. That was roughly the 15th or 18th of August. So it's now been over 2 months that he's been held in the Orange County Detention Facility. There are many of you in the room who don't need to hear the story because you've been hearing these stories over and over again as Merilie and others of you have made these trips into the detention facilities. What has been shocking to me is how little I appreciated what it means for his family that this man has been locked up. The rent in Spring Valley, New York, in the poorest part of our county, the cheapest 1-bedroom apartment you can find is $1,500 to $1,800 a month plus utilities. And they've lost their primary breadwinner. So this is a family that now has no financial support system, no ability to hire an attorney, and no ability really even to communicate with the primary breadwinner, with their father and husband, because every time he makes a phone call, it costs $1 a minute. They can't afford, they literally cannot afford to talk with him on the phone. And they're afraid to go and visit him because they don't know what will happen if they show up. Who else might be taken? So take that story and set that one aside also for a moment. Here's a third little story. I'm flying home on the red-eye tonight because tomorrow afternoon there's going to be a reunion at Stony Point Center of some 80 or 100 people who lived at Stony Point Center for 2 to 4 months, depending on their family situation, following Superstorm Sandy 7 years ago next week. And we're going to hold a 7-year reunion for them all to come back and celebrate their survival, which is no small thing. And I don't have to tell you, because you all, like I imagine, have been glued to the television for the last 48 hours, watching the fire in Tick Canyon. And as I watch these events happen and recognize that they are the new normal, that Superstorm Sandy was the third 100-year storm of the century that we had in New York in a period of 5 years, right? And the fires, I don't need to tell all of you, and the mudslides that take place in California at this point, what was considered a rare event has now become something everyone simply expects as a part of our lives together. And your situation and my situation is no different than almost anywhere else we might choose to plant ourselves across the country or around the world. The only real question is, what are the resources that a particular community has that they might be able to bring toward the act of fighting back against the impact of climate change and supporting people. But let's be clear, the number one challenge in our time for all of us is no longer a conversation about how we're going to reverse climate change. It's a conversation about how we will do our level best to mitigate climate change and then do our level best to respond to the incredible fallout that will result, that is resulting right now. Some 70 million people, the UN just revised its number, are on the move in the world today. 70 million refugees or internally displaced people around the world fleeing either climate change related disasters or the violence that is being carried out around the world. And let's be clear, friends, one way or another, these things are all connected. So I could share more stories. I could go on. Really, I could do this for the next 2 hours. And most of you in the room could share similar stories. And so last night, I was staying with my good friends Mark and Mary in their home. And I said to Mark yesterday afternoon as we were chatting with one another, something about this dilemma that I face, that I want to be a part of a movement that is intending to do something about these incredible crises that we confront. And too often, the church is pussyfooting around in too many ways. It's not about bad faith. In my experience, the church is full of really remarkably good people at all levels of our church. In our national staff, in our local communities, in our presbyteries, there are incredibly good people, many of whom are doing everything they can, much like Merilie does every day, to try and figure out how to push back, how to respond in these incredible situations. But as a body, friends, we need to name the reality that our responses are way too little and way too late, and we have so much work to do. And so I said to Mark, I don't know how to respond in this time. And Mark said something like this. Mark, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I went back to my room last night and wrote it down after our conversation. Mark said, Rick, I think the only answer at this point, assuming one doesn't choose to simply abandon one's Christian faith, is to recognize that actually we are inheritors of a radical gospel. And we carry the legacy of the earliest followers of Jesus in those earliest moments of what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. So our legacy, it's a choice that we can make, right? Where are we going to choose to put our feet down? Do we choose to side with the church in all of its incredible violence and the iterations that it has meant to be church since, what, the time of Constantine, right? Or do we look back to those earliest moments, those moments when Jesus and a wild group of men and women said, we don't have to live according to the rules of the dominant empire. We can create small communities of resistance that can actually make a difference. My question before all of us, the question in the book that Christy lifted up for all of you, is what does it mean for us to actually create those communities? So I want to be clear. The reason I'm here tonight is in part to honor Merilie, but it's also because, for my money, and I say this with a great deal of reflection, the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship is the organization best equipped to help the church out of this dilemma, or to guide us in a new direction. When this organization was founded 75 years ago, it was founded by a group of individuals who had courage of conviction enough to stand up and say, we will not fight in World War II. And they became conscientious objectors, and the earliest moments of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship were about providing support for those folks. And then we went through a very painful, challenging shift some 20 years ago now, when I had become a part of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, where we shifted our language intentionally away from the word pacifist and toward the word nonviolence. There were some old-timers who schooled me regularly on why that was a mistake. But I maintain that actually it was the right thing to do at the right moment in time. Because somehow we need to look for a way that we are responding to the overwhelming violence around us in a declarative way that brings a seriousness of purpose. But it doesn't stop there, because for my money, and Emily, you'll have to correct me about this one if I'm wrong, the Peace Fellowship is going through another transition right now. And in the way I understand this transition, the way I'm experiencing this transition, it's about trying to get to the roots of violence. Not how do we respond in nonviolence in this particular moment, but rather how do we look at what's going on that's driving the violence, environmental destruction, and the displacement of people that follows. is going to be the primary thing that drives violence for as long as I can see into the future. Certainly the rest of my life is going to be defined by that set of questions. Racism and systems of white supremacy are clearly at the heart of so much of the violence that we've all learned to just accept somehow as if it's the normal state of affairs. But it drives everything about us. We don't identify it as violence when we have the statistics that show that we're more prepared to spend money for people of color to be imprisoned than we are to support them to go to college, right? But those things are acts of violence, and they are built on decades and centuries of violence. And if we're not prepared to stand up and name it, and then actually take risks ourselves, particularly, like most of us in this room, those of us who have been beneficiaries, inadvertently perhaps, but beneficiaries all the same, of all that comes with that racism and those systems of white supremacy, do we have the courage of conviction to face even the ways in which we ourselves are being challenged by this set of questions? And conquest and the forces of empire that we muster at this point to carry out our project around the world. So clear in that triptych that I was standing in the Alcázar looking at just 3 weeks ago. That project has been a Christian project, my friends, for a very long time. And let's be clear, it is a Christian empire project that is driving that same set of realities in our country right now today. So, all of this brings me back to the text that's before us. I hate this text. I have never liked this story. It always has seemed to me to be kind of a petty argument where the people who have said no to the people who don't have. But just a few weeks ago, Sarah and I were part of a group of people that was actually the Presbyterian Mission Agency board members working this text. And a colleague of ours, Bryce Weeby, thank you. Bryce Weeby, lost his name for a second. Bryce Weeby said something that blew me out of the water. Bryce said, let's be clear, this story about the bridesmaids and the oil that I've been singing about, I went to camp. You remember that song, Give Me Oil for My Lamp? Keep it burning, burning, burning. Y'all remember that song, right? I've been living this story in one way or another. It's built into my very DNA, right? And Bryce helped me to understand, because he's smarter about these exegetical things than I am, that what we're looking at here is a story, a metaphor for righteousness. And the word righteousness, the way it's used by Jesus, can be translated today just as easily justice. So this is not a story about 5 bridesmaids who refuse to share their wealth with 5 other bridesmaids. According to Bryce, and I really like this is a story about 5 bridesmaids who said, this is about righteousness, and I can't share that with you. You have to do your own work. Think about that for a moment. We have to do our own work. This echoes for me of the stories that I've heard from, the comments that I've heard from my friends who are people of color who have said, yeah, Rick, not my job to help white people figure this out, right? It's your job. I got my own work to do, and I'm going to do it. I'm glad you're doing your work, but I can't tell you how to be righteous. You're going to have to figure out righteousness and justice on your own. What if that's what this story is about? Because let's be clear, we go right from this story about righteousness and justice and doing our own work, into this remarkable second story in the book of Matthew, which also troubled me for many years. I had given up on this story because of the crappy way that we preach it from our pulpits time after time about sharing our talents. Ridiculous and ludicrous, right? Because the only way to read the story, if it's about talents, and how I should do the best I can with my talents for God, is to assume that the harsh taskmaster, the master in this story, is a metaphor for God. And the master himself, at the accusation of the third slave, remember what he says? You knew, did you, that I was a harsh man, reaping where I did not sow, gathering where I did not scatter seed. Then you should have taken my money and put it in the bank and given it back to me with interest. So take this worthless slave and throw him into the outer darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it was in Guatemala where I got my education on this text some 20 years ago when Guatemalans said, "You are reading this text all wrong. This isn't a text that's a metaphor or an allegory for the kingdom of heaven. This is a story about just how brutal things were in Jesus' time, in his moment. This is exactly how it worked. The only way you could get this kind of wealth was by lending money to someone at exorbitant rates of interest that, by the way, Hebrew scripture condemned, right? And backing those loans were the titles to individual small landowners' property. Then you collect, because they can't make their payments, on the land, and you eventually have so much land that you can't manage it yourself. You have to travel for months or even years on end to manage all of your properties and entrust your slaves to do your work for you. And so the third slave in this story, for my money, is the hero. I knew what you were asking me to do. And then there's this little troubling piece that I still was struggling with up until just a couple of years ago. For years I'd been preaching this and then thinking, yes, but it says, I was afraid, right? The third slave says, I knew you were a harsh man and I was afraid. And I always thought, this doesn't show fear. This was a remarkable act. And I was working this text with a group of teenagers from a church outside Detroit about 2 years ago. And this young man, I'll never forget his name, Ben Church. Ben, who's in 9th grade, raised his hand and said, Rick, you're reading it all wrong. I was like, okay. He said, he's not afraid of the master. He's afraid of being like the master. He's opting out. Isn't that beautiful? Beautiful. And then we move into that last story. So you've got a story of what does righteousness and justice look like. You've got a story of the way things are, at least as brutal as they are confronting us in our moment in time right now today. And then finally, we move into that third story that we all know and love. I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was sick, I was naked, I was in prison, I was a stranger, you cared for me, right? And Jesus' answer, when they say, when, Lord, when did we do that? When you did it for one of the least of these, my siblings, you did it for me. This is a picture of Jesus' new rules. This is what it means for us to create small communities that insist in our communities, to the best of our ability, we're going to put a totally different set of values in the center of our communities. Whatever madness may be going around us, as we abandon any responsibility for the climate change disaster that we're creating. Whatever insanity we're creating as we go adventuring with military and economic policies around the world. Whatever craziness we are trying to carry out as a country around imprisonment of people of color. Whatever immigration madness we are carrying out, and it is madness, my friends, what is taking place right now. We will put these values at the very center and core of our work and life together. And that is what we're here to celebrate tonight. Merilie, I am deeply grateful to you because you've been teaching all of us in this room, and you're not alone, there are others doing it as well, what it means to ignore the reality around us and insist that you will do everything within your power. And that's the work all of us must do. So friends, I didn't get asked to do this, but I hope you will not leave the room tonight without writing down your name and saying, I want to be a part of this work with the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, because this is an organization that is actually pushing the church to be what and who it is called to be in a very difficult moment in time. And I hope that we will find moments like this to strengthen one another, to stand with one another, because at the end of the day, as Mark reminded me so eloquently and so pastorally yesterday, at the end of the day, where else are you going to go? Where else are you going to go? What are those words, Tom and Tim? All of us together. All of us roll a river. All of us together. All of us roll a river. Amen. Amen.